Alright, in this video I want to cover the process of rendering your stuff out. Regardless of what scene it is, everything's going to have essentially the same kind of workflow that you're going to go through. In this case, I have an animation of Andy just kind of like looking around. It's going to be used for another project for another class. So I'm just going to go in here. I'm going to set up one of my items to be a little bit higher quality. There we go. Hit 6, make sure all my textures show up that I need to. I don't see them showing up, and the reason it's not showing up is because my project isn't set. So I'm going to go to File, Set Project, and make sure I've told Maya what project I'm working in so that all of my materials are set up. Before you even opened your file, you should have had your project set up. Alright, so I'm going to go into the folder that I have this specific file here, which is 2540, character rig, and say set. And then I will reopen the file. So this is Andy hologram head. Yes, a couple error messages. I hit 6. I go here, set that to 1. There we go. So now we can see Andy with Andy's texture on there. Everything we do is going to be under this render settings area. So on the top you'll see this little gear with a little clapper by it. That's it. Or you can go to Window, Rendering Editors, Render Settings, Setup. Nope, not Render Setup. Window, Rendering Settings. There it is, Render Settings. So in here, we need to make sure that we're on Arnold, which we are. We have to give this a name. So typically you want to call this something with your name in it, and then whatever the project is. So in this case, I'm doing Andy hologram head. Again, whatever your project name is, that's what you would call it. So if you're doing bouncing ball, your last name underscore bouncing ball. If you had more than one camera in here, you may want to right click and say insert camera name. That way Maya will automatically call it whatever the camera name is. Okay. Image format, EXR is fine, so we'll leave that. All of these should be fine here. Under frame animation extension, we're going to set this to name.number.extension. Under the frame range, you punch in your frame range. So depending on how long your animation is, you may have a different frame range. My frame range is 1 to 222. You may have 10 to 45. Whatever it is, that's what you punch in. You pick your camera. So in this case, I'll close that. I'm using Perspective 2. I always like to take my camera and make sure I've given it a distinctive name so I know what it is, Render Cam. Now when I go back to my render settings, I go to my Render Cam. I punch in my resolution so you can check your cheat sheet for what you're going to be rendering. So 960 by 540. Under Arnold Render, you want to take these numbers up. The default is 3222. Typically, a camera AA is going to have to be at 4, maybe 5, depending on what you have in your scene. Just so you can see what it does, if I put this at 0, you can see how choppy the edges of Andy's rendering are. If I put this to 1, it improves that a little bit. If I put it to 2, it'll improve it more. On this one, I found specifically that 4 was a good number to have that at. Okay. Now, the more you have, the longer it's going to take to render, but that's fine because that's just how long it's going to take. You want your renderings to look good, and you can see how nice and smooth that is right now. Okay. You don't need to zoom in, this much percent. That's several thousand %. Looking down here, I can see this is 960 by 540, 1 to 1. This is what I'm going to see. So as long as I don't see any blockiness, I'm good with that. Same thing with diffuse. You might get diffuse that looks really grainy or spotty, and you may need to crank that up. Same thing with specular. You may get reflections or highlights that look spotty or grainy, and you may need to pull that up 3, 4, whatever. Typically 4, 3, and 3 are good numbers to go with for some basic scenes that we'll be working on. In this area, there's not anything else that we need to play with except for motion blur. In some scenes, we will use motion blur. So it's important that you obviously have the settings correct so that you render it correctly. Some things that we need to pay attention to is having deformation on or off. Typically you want deformation on, and typically you don't want camera on. Okay, now it'll depend on your specific scene, but having deformation on will make sure that all your stuff gets deformed correctly. Having camera on will blur as the camera is moving. So if my camera swings far to the right, there'll be a lot of motion blur on it and won't really see it. So typically you may not want to have camera on. And then shaders is, in my version, I don't believe it's in yours. You can leave that on or off. I don't think anything specific that's blurring in this one. If you needed to, your motion blur wasn't turning out as smooth as you thought, you may need to take this up to maybe 3, maybe 4. Okay, and that'll help smooth out some of the motion blur. And then center of frame is typically fine. Sometimes I find end of frame looks better. And you'll see it when you render something out that's motion blurred, where the motion blur is happening on it. Okay, sometimes if it's at center or if it's at start, it'll look like the item is actually never actually hitting the item it's supposed to. Like in a bouncing ball, the ball will come in and it'll like look like it's about to hit the ground, but not. It just jumps away. So you may want to put that at end of frame if you're getting some weird results whenever there's a collision supposed to be happening. Okay, center of frame is typically fine. And then that's pretty much it. You don't need to play with anything under system or AOVs. I typically do because I like to render out extra stuff. That's for a different lecture, not for today. But that's typically something that I would have on my scene. Okay, so under the common tab, you gave it a name. We went through these settings here, ... Under here, you changed your sampling and you changed motion blur if it was needed. And then we close it. Now, when we render inside of here, we're going to switch to the rendering menu. We're going to go to render and say render sequence option box. If we're only rendering one camera, we can just pick from this list. Here's my render cam, boom, and then say go. If we're going to do more than one camera, we're going to say all render enabled cameras. And what that means is I have several cameras in my outliner here and 2 there. I'm going to click on this one, perspective, and go to the attribute editor. Under output settings, where is you? There it is. Perspective is not renderable, so it wouldn't render that one. Top view is not, front view is not, side view is not, perspective 1 is not, but render cam is, so it would render that one. If I want to render out both of these, I would just click on that and say renderable, and then that would render also when I clicked all render enabled cameras. Okay, everything else in here we typically don't need to worry about. So then you hit render sequence and close. And then what this is going to do is it's going to render your stuff out. Now it locks up your screen, it does its thinking stuff. Your job at this point is to watch it and make sure that what it's rendering is correct. If it's rendering from the wrong camera, the lighting isn't there, the materials aren't there, whatever it is, you have to pay attention to all that because it could make or break your animation. You could spend 3 days rendering or a day rendering or an hour rendering, and you come back and your stuff is just not rendering the correct way. If it's rendering the wrong camera, you can just hit escape. I'm going to close this. And I'm going to open up this render view here. This is Maya's render view. This is typically where it renders from. And I'm going to right click. I'm going to hit escape on this again. I'm going to right click on this menu and make sure this is set to my render cam, which it currently is. And then I'm going to go to the Arnold render view. I can just do open. And then make sure that this is also set to my render cam. And so now if I've made sure those are right, then when I go back to that render sequence, everything should work. And you don't have to worry about deleting files. Once you hit render, let it go through its thing, you're good. It'll just overwrite any of those files. I think it's also important to make sure that your stuff is going into the right spot. I'm going to hit escape for a second just so I can get to this screen underneath this. Come on. I'm hitting escape. There we go. If I go down at the bottom here while I'm rendering this, and I watch, this is going to tell me where it's saving my files to. So it's going into my folder, character rig, images, ... If it didn't go here, if it's saving in somewhere else, that means my project isn't set. And again, I would have to cancel it, go to set my project, and then let it render. If it goes in someone else's folders, they may just delete your stuff, and I'm sure you would not be happy with someone deleting your stuff. Or they may not know it's your stuff and just get rid of it anyway on accident. Or you just may not ever be able to find it because you named it something weird. Okay? So that's the process of taking your file and then actually rendering it out. The lighting is good in this case. The materials are good. The animation is good. So I'm happy with it. So we render.